Hi, my name is Tom Johnson. I'm a technical writer based in Seattle. I have a blog called I'dRatherBeWriting.com. On it, I have been exploring some techniques for using AI tools to help write documentation. You can find them under here, TechWriter plus AI on the top menu. Go to Prompt Engineering for Tech Writing Scenarios and you'll see them on the left. Now, today I'm going to be talking through using file diffs for better release notes in reference docs, which is kind of a mouthful. Might not be entirely clear what I mean here. But if there's one thing that I do that most tech writers do pretty regularly, it's write release notes for the changes that are being pushed out for an API. Usually every 2 weeks, every month, every week even, there are changes and you need to describe everything that's new, everything that's been deprecated or otherwise updated in the release. I find that users really want to know everything that has changed, especially if those changes could affect their implementations. They want to know if like a method has been renamed or a parameter has been tweaked or added or something. So typically, you could reach out to engineers and say, hey, I've got a draft doc here. Can you go ahead and list all the like new features and changes for the release notes? And you might get just kind of brief responses. People don't really want to be exact about class or method names or other kind of details, and they kind of keep it very high level and general, and they maybe don't list all the details. This technique will allow you to really dive into the details. All right, so let's jump into basically the approach. All right, and this is something that I find that actually works quite well. And so this is a tried and true technique. I've been doing this for the last month, 2 months with reference docs, or not just reference docs, with all release notes really. But so much of the release is focused around an API. The reference docs are essential. And here's what I do. Okay, so let's say there are changes in an API. I regenerate the reference documentation using whatever script I've developed. Different platforms have different approaches for this, and different languages have different reference docs, so I won't get into those details. But basically, once you generate out a new version of the reference material, now, at least if you're in a docs as code system, you have a sort of change list, or you have you have the potential to mine a file diff for that change list. Terminology is going to vary by platform and different tools and so on. But basically, you want to capture the file diff between your previous reference docs and your new reference docs for the new release. And that file diff is something you'll pass into an AI tool to describe the differences. If you're using Git, this is like a git diff command of some kind. But yeah, different systems are going to have different commands. But if you can get a hold of a programmatic list of file diffs, meaning something that like a computer output into a terminal with little pluses and minuses about things that have changed, that is gold for writing release notes. This is also why I really prefer to generate reference material myself, is because I can more completely control getting that reference doc change list. So anyway, okay. Here's the prompt, all right, that you can pass into an AI. You're a technical writer creating release notes for an API. The target audience for the release notes consists of experienced developers who integrate the AI API into their applications. They rely on detailed documentation and so on. You'll be provided with a file diff output of all the changed files in the release. the diff describes the changes in the reference documentation, which directly reflects how the code has changed. Your task is to analyze the diff and clearly describe the changes. I'll pull from your descriptions to populate the release notes. Ignore grammar and stylistic changes. Provide some instructions on how to interpret the diff syntax. I don't know if you really need to do this, but you could specify that, hey, plus means something was added, minus means something was taken away. Little ampersands indicate line numbers, before and after, and so on. So, all right, then jump down to the task. Analyze the diff and describe the changes that have been made using plain, readable language. Your analysis will mostly be matter of fact, describing the changes. The file diff won't tell you why the changes have been made or what the larger purpose is behind the changes. That's all right, as I'll supplement the matter of fact changes with this larger context from other sources. Your task is mainly to describe the differences in the file diff. Especially note the following: new features, deprecations, other changes. You can add some style rules here. For example, avoid adjectives. Be precise with field and class names. Use the correct capitalization, the full name. Keep language concise and technical. You might want markdown as the output syntax, and then you can give some examples. The process data method now includes a report fields parameter, which lets you specify a report for the list of data you want to process. This is just fictional here. And so on. All right, so you get the idea. And I've added more detail in the prompt. It's pretty detailed. One tip you can do is actually get AI to help you flesh out the detail of your prompts. That way you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to bang that out, and then you can kind of adjust it especially based on how good it's performing. But this prompt works pretty well. So you basically have your file diff, and you pass that in here as the part of the prompt, as well as the instructions that I've mostly read here. And then AI will generate release notes for you. Now, as I said in the prompt, one major gap in the release notes is the why. Why did we change this file name? Why did we do this? Why was this deprecated? That's not going to be something it can figure out, so I prefer to just not have the AI try to guess what those purposes are. Instead, I'll go to the engineers and say, hey, can you kind of fill in these details with more of the purpose or the context about why these changes were made, and so on. But getting an output that has a matter-of-fact list of changes is like 70% of release notes. And it's what users really like. They like to have a very comprehensive set of everything that has changed, even if it's just a factual thing. Even if you can't get the reason why we deprecated something, or maybe you're not allowed to explain why we deprecated something, just the fact that you deprecated something, even if it's just a value in an enum or something, that's pretty good. All right, now before continuing here, I want to pause briefly and share a brief excerpt from our sponsors. This is a podcast I did with Karen Brown at Zoom In Software on uncovering and communicating the value of TechCom. It's about 2 minutes, and then we'll return here. But there's another value that you briefly mentioned about documentation providing resolutions for support cases, or somehow tying in with that angle. And this is one aspect that I think a lot of tech writers can probe. You can look and see how many support cases referenced documentation in the thread, or somehow documentation played a role. Can you speak a little bit about that? Like how do tech writers go about kind of probing the impact of docs in support cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, I would differentiate between three, I would say, use cases of that connection between documentation and support. The first one is case resolved with documentation. The second is cases deflected. And this third one is agent efficiency, which means that agents have used documentation in order to resolve a support ticket. So if you think about cases resolved with documentation, this is where you actually need to understand a little bit how your support team are classifying the different support tickets. Because what we've seen is that, let's say that a typical classification will be feature request or reporting a bug, or a how to question, right? Like, how do I do this or how do I do that, right? Now, usually the questions or the tickets, sorry, that are tagged as how to's can easily be resolved with documentation. And this is exactly this is the bucket that you want to tap on and see what's happening with this.
All right, thanks for listening to that. Another consideration you might have is whether you should kind of go file by file or pass in all the file diffs at once. Depends how large your release is, but let's say in the release there were 10 files that had changed. Depending upon what tool you're using, you can get a diff for just that specific file's changes and proceed that way and go file by file with a different prompt for each file, a separate prompt for each file. Or, and by the way, when I say separate prompt, you can start out with the prompt that I shared for one file and then pass in the diff of another file and say do the same, and do the same and so on, but with separate prompts. This gives the AI tool more ability to kind of focus in on something smaller, and it's usually a little more accurate. Plus, it gives you the time as a tech writer to look at the output and assess it and say, that looks right, or wow, that looks a little weird. And you can go in and look specifically at that file diff and be like, why did it say this? Or is this really the case? And you can verify it that way. Whereas if you have just this huge chunk of file diffs and you pass that in, let's say it's 20, 30 pages, and suddenly the AI is saying things and you're like, whoa, is this real? Which part of the file diff did it pull that information from? It's going to be a lot harder to kind of track that down. So I prefer file by file. It's more tedious, granted. Might take you another 10 minutes and a lot of pasting and just reprompting and so on, but the output might be better, and that will save you more time. I already mentioned that the file diff doesn't really provide you the why, but again, the why is not always something you can explain. For whatever product you have, whatever reasons, the why might not be something you can explain in detail anyway. But one other technique, I haven't really talked about it much in this prompt, but I also link anytime there's like a class, method, any kind of code element mentioned, I always link to it in the release notes, because you want to make sure that it's accurate, that your release notes are accurate. And if you can go in and actually provide a link to any code element mentioned, it's a way of making sure that the content is accurate. Because if the code element doesn't exist, first of all, that's a clear sign that something's gone wrong. But also, it also provides a little more ethos in your output. It's like it gives a vibe of accuracy because it's got direct links. It's almost like little hyperlinks to the sources in your output. People can go through and verify. They can say, oh, they added this new parameter. Oh, okay, yeah. Now I click it and I go directly into the reference, and they're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what it is. It adds such and such detail, or it allows you to do X, Y, and Z. And then they can jump back into the release notes. Now, There's another technique that I have for automatically linking all those things. Basically involves passing in your reference content and asking the AI to provide markdown links to the code elements mentioned. It's not rocket science, but it is a separate topic, so I don't really want to go into that. But basically, I really wanted to call your attention to the importance of file diffs. I mean, this is something that I had overlooked in writing release notes for years, because like they're kind of techie looking at file diffs, and they're tedious to look through. It's like you have to really look at a terminal output with a bunch of pluses and minuses and try to compare. Or I guess other tools give you more of a visual side-by-side interface. But in general, they're not easy to kind of parse through, but they are easy to parse through for an AI tool and a machine. And you definitely want to be drawing upon this. In writing release notes like this, it has saved a ton of time for me as well as the engineers. They don't have to sit there and try to write a draft of release notes or be specific about everything that's changed. And I feel way more confident in knowing that I am not letting things slip through. There's no changes that I'm kind of missing because people didn't mention them. And that's going to avoid documentation drift in a major way. I'm the gatekeeper. Like the tech writer is a gatekeeper for all the changes that go out. They have to be reflected somewhere in documentation updates. And if changes are going out and you're not catching them, then your documentation is gradually going more and more out of date. And this is a tremendous technique for actually making sure you catch everything. It works. Like this really works. And if you write release notes, you should for sure be using a technique like this or similar. See if you can get a hold of the file diffs, generate your reference documentation, use those in your prompts for release notes, and you'll probably have a good experience. Again, my name is Tom Johnson. My blog is I'dRatherBeWriting.com. You can find more prompt engineering techniques specifically for documentation and tech writers on my site at TechWriter Plus AI. Thanks for listening.